This week, we welcome Jeff Pollard, Vice President, Principal Analyst on the Security and Risk Team at Forrester Research, to review the CISOs 2023 Planning Guide, forecast the recession's impact on your program. In the Leadership and Communications section, the CISO of tomorrow is stepping into the business spotlight. Why a risk-based cybersecurity strategy is the way to go, the rise and fall of the Uber CISO and the future of the cybersecurity industry, and more. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly.
The shift to remote and hybrid work over the past 2 years has accelerated application development on cloud infrastructure. However, securing these new assets has lagged behind. Qualys CloudView, the next generation cloud security posture management, delivers an end-to-end multi-cloud security and compliance solution encompassing the entire application lifecycle from build to runtime. CloudView enables enterprises to assess their cloud security and compliance posture, identify risks and gaps, auto-remediate issues, proactively enforce best practices, improve compliance and audits rapidly and efficiently. Identify your most vulnerable cloud assets by visiting securityweekly.com/Qualys.
It's time to rethink how we approach cybersecurity because the reality is modern cyber attackers are already past your initial defenses. ExtraHop helps your security team find and eradicate advanced threats before real damage is done. Protect your enterprise and customers with better defense. Learn more about how ExtraHop stops advanced threats at securityweekly.com/ExtraHop. That's extra HOP.
Managing and protecting the world's grueling number of endpoints, enabling Tanium's customers to see, control, and protect every endpoint everywhere. Tanium's mission is to provide certainty in uncertain times with the industry's only converged endpoint management. Trusted by the U.S. military and the majority of the Fortune 100, today, Tanium helps manage and protect nearly 30 million endpoints. Tanium, the power of certainty. Visit securityweekly.com/Tanium to learn more.
Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 280, recorded October 10th, 2022. I am your host, Matt Alderman. It's happy Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day for everybody who has the day off. Joining remotely are my co-hosts. First, welcome back, Mr. Jason Albuquerque.
It's great to be back. Listen, I had a great time in Nashville, but it's been a while since we talked about football. My New England Patriots third-string quarterback almost beat Green Bay and Mr. Aaron Rodgers, which was absolutely insane. And then he came in and won a great battle. Not a great battle because we killed him against Detroit. I mean, Detroit's not a tough adversary, but not bad for a third-string quarterback.
And Jason, just so you know, the Browns still stink and the Broncos still stink. But the Cowboys are actually looking pretty decent without Dak Prescott. I'm just saying.
Right. I know. So we'll see what kind of season we have, but our third-string quarterback ain't too bad.
Yeah, there you go. Also returning for like the third week in a row, Mr. Tyler Robinson. You're becoming a regular.
You know, I just can't get enough.
Oh, I love it. Do you have
Tyler needs to start watching football.
Yeah, right. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and submitting the form. We review suggestions often and will reach out to you once reviewed. Jeff Pollard primarily contributes to Forrester's offerings for security and risk professionals. He leads Forrester's research on the role of the CISO, specializing in topics related to security strategy, budget, metrics, business cases, and presenting to the board. His research also includes security services, featuring global coverage of managed security services, professional security services, and security as a service. Jeff also takes an active role in Forrester's forward-looking research on security innovation, the security market, and security predictions. Jeff, welcome to Business Security Weekly.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yes, we've had a lot of Forrester analysts on in the past. We've had a great relationship with Forrester. And as Forrester publishes new research, I love to bring on the analysts to talk through things. This is your first time, so welcome. Hopefully we can do more of these because you cover a lot of the topics that our audience probably has a lot of interest in. So pleasure to have you.
Yeah, awesome.
We're going to talk security budgets for 2023. But before we get into some of the research findings, as we were preparing for this call last week, you said something really interesting that I want to get on the air. You were talking about security being fatalistic and risk being probabilistic. And this is one of the challenges we have between security and risk. I want you to explain that a little bit for the listeners because you had this really great take on the differences between security and risk.
Yeah, so the way that we often frame this, and one of my colleagues, Renee Murphy, covers risk, and so she's got a risk and audit background. And the way that we often frame it is that, security and risk are a little bit like, men are from Mars and women are from Venus. Although if we update it now, we'll often say sort of different love languages, if you will. So security has a love language and risk has a love language. And what I find is that a lot of security leaders that did sort of grow up, if you will, through the technology track, often have a more sort of fatalistic or dystopian view of risk, where everything is kind of bad and everything is sort of inevitable, which frankly makes a lot of sense, given that often security leaders have to prove a negative and are sort of waiting to find the bad thing in the environment. But risk managers, in particular, they have a much more sort of calculated view of risk, right? Risk is something that can be exploited. Risk is something that can create opportunities for an organization. And frankly, a lot of businesses are actually in the business of arbitraging risk. That's what they do. So one of the things that we try to do in our research is sort of explain to security leaders that don't necessarily think about risk in this sort of kind of way that you might have in the past with fatalistic and whatnot. Think about it in terms of trade-offs and opportunity costs, right? There are lots of things in this world that are dangerous. You still do them every day. It could be commuting to work, other things, because the trade-off of not working isn't worth it. You need to have a job. So that's kind of the way we present it. But I do find that a lot of security leaders have that overly sort of fatalistic view of risk. And that attitude really shows up when they're talking to more experienced risk professionals in particular, or boards and business leaders that, again, are in the business of arbitraging risk to some degree.
And Jeff, your thought, security leaders have been struggling to get that highest level seat at the table for a long time, right? Do you think that's why risk has been able to kind of break that barrier to the business and have those more business conversations and be able to have that seat at the table? Because they understand that risk is a part of doing business. And being able to make intelligent decisions around risk is part of the business.
I think so. And let's look at one of the disciplines where risk is sort of, in theory, mapped out the best, right? Or calculated out the best. It's when it comes to the world of capital, financing, debt, equity, investments, et cetera. And so you've got to have very strong risk management procedures in that world. And naturally, the CFO right there, been there the whole time, right alongside the CEO. The security leader is sort of getting that access now and having to really think about the conversation differently. But one of the things we found in our research, we're publishing this soon, based on 2022 Forrester data, so just kind of came back in the last month or so, what we found is now 47% of security leaders in organizations above 1,000 employees are aligned with the CEO or the board. So they're no longer reporting into IT. Only 33% of security leaders are aligned with IT now. That's reporting into a director, VP, or CIO level role. 47% are reporting into the CEO or a board level committee. So through all that toil, that hard work, that sort of getting up and trying to get that access, they have it now. So now it's about sort of sustaining that access and contributing like a member of the C-suite.
So do you see with those numbers, the most successful CISOs are the ones who started to use a risk management type strategy? Are they aligning more with that risk strategy? Because for a long time, and Matt can attest to this, I've been saying, as a security leader, start embracing risk and business risk, or you're going to end up reporting to one, right? Someone who does manage risk for the organization. So do you see them taking that more risk-based strategy and aligning to the business better?
I see a lot of people trying it, but here's what worries me about the sort of riskification of security, and frankly, the riskification of marketing as well, because If you look at what vendors are doing out there in the world now, you'll find a whole lot of press releases that sort of 5 years ago, they had the word single pane of glass, and now they have the word risk dashboard. So we're seeing the commoditization of the commodification of risk to some extent. Here's what worries me. I think security leaders that get savvy with this and understand things like risk quantification, understand why they need to frame things in those terms, I think they'll be successful. On the flip side, security leaders that overuse risk or use it in the entirely wrong way, I think it's going to get them fired. I think that risk will get a CISO fired this year. And I don't mean the concept, I mean misuse of it, not maturing how you understand that is going to be a real problem, because I think the board gets fatigued when they hear doom and gloom versions of risk versus trade-offs, opportunity cost, how you're prioritizing things. That's a really mature version of risk, and that's what security leaders need to get to.
Yep, no, that makes sense.
Doesn't that require a little bit more mature board, though, in order to get to that point? Otherwise, you end up with not having a board that is listening or understanding, and the quantification or qualification of those risks can't be really identified without impact.
Yeah, well, that's one of the challenges security leaders have is they're in front of boards sometimes that don't have a security person involved. Maybe they have a steering committee where a few people do. A lot of board members might have grown up in sort of a world or had their business success in a world where cybersecurity was buried 3 to 5 levels below in IT, pure cost center mindset. They're not thinking of things like product security, which is protecting the revenue of the stuff you sell. And they're also not thinking about the fact that, one of the advantages security leaders have is that there are insulating factors for security budget, and there are insulating factors for what security is doing. When you think about one, the one we all know about, the sort of one that we've all dealt with this entire time, regulation. So requirements that are put on based on the industry that you operate in, the geography, or where your customers are from. So that's a protective factor to some extent. The other protective and sort of factors insulating security budgets are around sort of third-party risk management, so customer requirements for security, as well as the sort of monster that's hiding under everyone's bed now, cyber insurance, right? They jump out and get you right when you get done with the attestation, and then you can't sleep again. So part of what a savvy security leader is going to do is use those factors to explain these things to the board. So it's less about this kind of abstract concept of even risk or quantification without impact. And instead, it's about here are the segments we operate in. Here are the things that we're required to do. Here are the things our customers are asking us for. And that is why I'm doing the things that I've done. It's not because I wanted to. It's not because we were having fun and growth, in the heady times of growth, and you were writing us checks and we were spending them. It's been wonderful. Instead, it was, look, we have customers asking us for these controls. This is why we spent this money. And being able to go to the board and saying, there's risk here, but there's also the loss of a market opportunity. If we don't have these controls, there are customers that may not have signed a deal with us. And I'm actually giving a talk about this in November at our event where I kind of lay out a methodology for it. But to me, that's part of the savvier conversation. It's not all risk. That's not the answer. Risk is a part of the answer. And the other part is, look, when we talk about risk and opportunity costs and trade-offs, this is what our customers say they want us to do. If we want to pursue customers like this, we have to do things like that, or they're not going to work with us.
Yeah, and we as leaders have to take the opportunity to educate the board, right? To your point, and give them that education as to the current state. I mean, you're absolutely correct. I've dealt with, that entire vendor risk management portion of it, as a global IT services provider, where customers would say, listen, you're not meeting our controls, our minimum controls. You have, 6 months to remediate. And if you don't, we're out of here. We're not signing another contract with you, right? And that's a lot of annual reoccurring revenue that could disappear. So and
the board
around, with the board around that.
You do. You're so right. And here's the other part of educating the board. Most board members are not on just one board. Mm-hmm. These are successful people. They're on multiple boards. If as a security leader, you aren't the person that's leading that education, someone else is. Yep. Someone at one of the other companies they're on. And the last thing that you want is to be the security leader where your board starts asking you somewhat informed questions and you haven't been the person that said that. And this happened a few years ago. One of the interesting things, we did a giant project. We talked to about 30 to 40 board members, about 60 to 70 security leaders about 3.5 years ago. And one of the sort of findings out of that is take something like framing security by NIST CSF, the cybersecurity framework. What was interesting is that board said it was almost a network effect like social media. They were a board member of 3 or 4 companies. Well, CISO at company A started talking in terms of NIST CSF. CISO at company B started talking about NIST CSF. When they were in the meetings with, the CISO at company C and D, hey, why don't you use NIST CSF for the security program? And those CISOs are caught flat-footed saying, oh, well, we do. Those slides aren't in my, how do you know about that? So if you're not the one doing it, someone else is. And so you might as well be the person that's helping to help, sort of teach your board, understand security, but more importantly, understand your approach to security for the company itself, right?
Yeah,
so if you aren't, somebody else will. Yeah.
It allows you to drive the narrative, right? Drive that
Absolutely.
narrative, educate the board, be that thought leader instead of being reactive, right?
Yes.
Definitely the better position.
Absolutely.
Now you see why I started the conversation here, because this then rolls into the planning guide, right? From a security versus risk perspective, how are you best positioned as a CISO to get ready for what's coming, which is scrutiny of budgets, right? We know it. We know it's coming because we're in a market kind of downturn. And so as you start thinking about your budgets for 2023, you have to start thinking about what are the risk areas that could be opportunity drivers and where am I going to prioritize spending, right? I think that's a really important thing to think about. And so Jeff, as you were out putting the planning guide together, what are some of those key areas where we see increased risk, therefore probably some increased preparation or spending? And then we'll talk about the flip side of that. Where are you seeing things kind of actually go the other way? Less risk, maybe therefore less spending. Let's start with where the increase is coming.
Yeah, I think the increases fall into some fairly straightforward areas, but important ones to dive into. Application security, which is occasionally security sort of oft ignored kind of cousin, if you will, right? I always have fun sort of going to Black Hat at Innovation Sandbox or whatnot, even our RSA with Innovation Sandbox, and seeing sort of the AppSec vendors that are sort of, half ignored by the rest of the world. But I think application security is going to be a huge area, especially because of product security, right? Again, that kind of secure what you sell. These things are generating revenue. There are problems out there with enterprises consuming it. Certainly, if you're a B2B company, AppSec, API security are going to be areas that you need to really pay attention to. Of course, cloud security, which almost feels strange to say to some extent, because cloud sort of is like 16 to 17 years old. It's getting his driver's license, hanging out with his friends. Hopefully it's home by curfew. But security's kind of just learning about it in some cases, right? We haven't had to deal with it as much. So cloud security is certainly a part of that. The last couple of years brought back the kind of resurgence of ransomware, for lack of a better way to put it. So detection and response are certainly key areas. And then, of course, identity and access management, especially customer-facing identity and access management, are areas where we are seeing lots and lots of attention. As someone that covers, security services, where I'm lucky is that security services operate in all of these areas. And of course, when you do encounter a downturn, you do find a lot of organizations turning more towards services, although in good ways and bad ways. In good ways, because maybe they know they can't hire, so it's easier to sort of transfer that budget over. In bad ways, though, where they start to think about outsourcing, offshoring, labor arbitrage to drive down cost, where they know that they're going to accept kind of a worse security posture, but they need to because their company has really encountered that turbulence. And so they just need to save as much as they can. So again, some real trade-offs there. But those are the areas primarily that I see a lot more attention going and a lot more budget going as well.
Yeah, so you hit two of my three key areas: applications and users. Most people on the show know I'm an app user data guy. Data, obviously, ransomware plays into this. And it's funny, you mentioned Innovation Sandbox and all the technologies. You want to see, I want to see more app user data guys in those sandboxes because I see such the need to secure those areas, but yet we get the next zero trust vendor or the next XDR vendor. And yeah, anyways, but it's interesting, app and user are on that top list.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now let's talk about. Go ahead. Was that Tyler?
No, I was going to say, from someone who managed a budget for an enterprise organization, I look at this level of disruption as an opportunity, right? Because for me, I understand we're going down an economic downturn. I understand we're going to be tightening belts and getting tighter budgets and having more scrutiny. But you want to know what? For the past couple of years, leaders in this space have been saying, I need to consolidate. I need to realize economies of scale. I need to start lessening my tool sets and building an ecosystem. You want to know what? This is the perfect opportunity to sit down with the CFO and say, I have 60 tools. I want to consolidate down to 15. I'm building a strategy around this, right? Now you can start showing fiscal responsibility to your CFO and to your CEO and to your board while getting that same outcome. So, disruption is always opportunity for me. And this is where I start looking at consolidation, building out the ecosystems, economies of scale, partnering with other organizations. All of those fiscal conversations can actually be a benefit to your team.
Well, not only that, I think the other part of this too is you can pay down some of that security debt,
sure,
or tech debt, if you will. If you've been in go, go, go mode and responding to whatever the most urgent priority is, because let's face it, most security leaders, most enterprise leaders, especially in growth times, you're not solving the most important problems you could solve. You're generally solving the most urgent problem in that moment that you can solve. Well, in the moment of a downturn, when things might be contracting, when things are paused a little bit, that is a time to do some of that introspection and say, what can we optimize? What can we consolidate? How can I pay down some of that security debt? And oh, by the way, if you're thinking about protecting headcount, which most security leaders want to protect that more than anything because it was hard enough to get those people on board, well, this is a great opportunity to, show that you have people doing something. So we're worried about losing headcount. Well, here are the projects I have those people working on that will save us money long term when I work with the CFO, when I think about consolidation.
Or
so
Jeff, right. This is a strategy that I've used. Here's how my team can generate direct revenue to the organization.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? That's another, because once you start generating revenue, now your value just went up a few notches, right? So, think outside the box. How can you be providing services to other organizations? How can you help generate revenue for your organization? How can you work with other business leaders, right, to help get the technologies that they need while following your security strategy? I mean, you can get really innovative, and as long as you have great partnerships around the organization, you can really start thinking outside of the box, save money, realize economies of scale, consolidate, and hey, by the way, even drive revenue.
Yeah, totally agree.
Last week, I told you, Jeff, we had our CISO advisory board down in Austin, and we asked a question about what is your minimal viable security, right? And so Alan Alford, who's on our advisory board, also runs the Cyber Ranch podcast, sent out a poll on LinkedIn, said, hey, what's your MVS, right? And he wanted really the top 3 to 4, right? And we hit on a couple of these. He talked about, SaaS and cloud, identity, MFA in that mix, et cetera, et cetera. But what we also heard was some of the things that aren't as high a priority when budgets are under scrutiny. So, for example, one of the things that came up was, do I need a tier 2 email security vendor if I'm using O365? Is Microsoft providing enough? Am I going to spend money there? So as you think about this from the other side, like, what are the technologies that are being evaluated is, do I need them or not? Where are the areas where you might be able to save some budget money in your 2023 planning?
I think this is coming in 2 different ways. There are some things, can we get rid of them, which is less often the case, but also, to Jason's point, can we consolidate? So there are a lot of platform vendors that exist now out there that are bringing in, let's take XDR, security analytics, SIM, SOAR, that sort of role covered by my colleague, Ali Mellon. She spends a ton of time in that arena. Well, there are a lot of bundle players in that segment where you can go all in and get all of those solutions from a particular provider. So you're able to, 1, consolidate your tech stack, 2, take advantage of a lot of bundling. And of course, Microsoft has probably been the most aggressive in this across the broader cybersecurity industry lately, often with IT relationships, not as often necessarily with security, where if you go with E5, you can get all of that, or one of the versions of E5, which, to be fair, does take sort of knowledge of the occult to figure out in some cases, because Microsoft licensing isn't necessarily easy.
You need a PhD in Microsoft licensing.
Yeah, exactly. But that being said, you can bundle a lot of those things, and so that's certainly one of the keys. I would stress, though, and this is one that came from a practice lead at one of the large cybersecurity firms out there I've covered, one of the things he stresses is, look, if you want to consolidate, take advantage of bundling, that makes a ton of sense. You'll get some discounts, you'll lower your cost. If you think it's going to make things more efficient or less complex, I have news for you. Probably not, at least not in the first few years, because you've got to, you've still got your processes, you've still got, integrations that need to take place. So I think one, on the consolidation front, there's a tremendous opportunity to save some budget there. Then I think there's also an examination of what technologies can go away now. Let's take, you mentioned zero trust. Let's think about zero trust edge, zero trust network access. If you've got a bunch of VPN appliances that are hung somewhere that everyone logged into, if you didn't get rid of those a couple of years ago when work from home started, you're probably opportunistically thinking about getting rid of those now and going with a zero trust approach that is really focused on the app and the user, as opposed to the sort of legacy network access. So that's one of those areas where, not that network security is disappearing, but we're certainly looking at how can we use zero trust to eliminate things like VPNs, which just we don't really need them anymore.
They don't really scale.
Another place that I always look though is adoption, right? So, IT and security folks are notorious for not adopting, tools to their greatest capability. I want to say, most IT organizations adopt 20% of a tool. So for me, it's really doing an analysis on how much of this tool is adopted. We're only using 20% of the capability. Well, where can I go get that in another portion of my ecosystem, right? Is there overlap? We're really good at throwing money at shiny tools and then not adopting them. So I would rather adopt 80% of a capability than have, this Gartner Magic Quadrant, whatever, that we buy and only using 20% of it. I mean, at the end of the day, that's zero value, right? It brings almost no value to the organization because it's just a shiny tool and it's an expense. So
yeah, I mean, as a service,
maximize adoption.
Yeah, and as a services guy, look, you're preaching to the choir there to some extent, because one of the things I've always said is the greatest thing about covering security services for me is that I'm perpetually in vogue because there's always a product over-promising and under-delivering, or to your point, 20 to 40% implemented, and then you've got to go in and sort of take advantage. So I do think that's one of those areas where services can offer a lot. And the real change that's happened in the market is that services companies went from kind of being this your mess for less bolted on to now being a viable solution first and foremost, where they got more prescriptive, or they started developing the IP themselves and they take that to market as a service as well. Mm-hmm. So I think you're absolutely right there. There is a ton of shelfware. Where can you consolidate? But there is kind of a dark side of this, if you will. One of the problems that I hear about a lot from security leaders is that they've complained for years on too many vendors and too many tools, too many vendors, too many tools. Well, then someone does come in the door with a portfolio solution. Maybe it's folks we've talked about so far. Maybe it's someone else. And all of a sudden, they kind of bust in the room like the Kool-Aid man, like, oh, yeah, I can discount everything. And security leaders are like, oh, no. I don't want to. These tools are too important. But then they're faced with the CFO and the CIO who says, well, wait, for 3 years now, you've told us too many tools, right, too many products, too many tools, too many products. And now you're telling us that someone can take some of those away, but you don't like that. Which one is it? And to some extent, security leaders have painted themselves in a bit of a corner with that, where you've really got to pick and choose if you're going to fight for a specific product or service. Well, why do you need that versus the bundle? And that's been a real problem that they're facing now, especially in light of the changing economic conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great point. I mean, once you put that line in the sand, you need to be able to commit to it, right? And show that you're actually moving down that strategy. Otherwise, you're gonna lose the trust of your CFO. You're gonna lose the trust of your board and your CEO, because you're preaching a certain strategy, and then when the cards hit the table, you're saying thanks but no thanks. Yeah, you have to commit. You have to.
And it seems emotional. It seems like it's attachment. Mm-hmm. So it's not, is this tool really better than the other? Well, can you quantify that? Can you prove it? Maybe, maybe not. That's certainly one of the things that Forrester Waves do, for example. Yeah. But when you're arguing at that level, it's kind of like, look, for 3 years you said this is a problem. Now we're giving you a solution, and you're saying you want to hang on to it. Is this politics? Is it agency? Is it emotional? You're right. You can lose a lot of credibility there for sure.
Do you think? I mean, so many of us who've grown up in this industry always talked about defense in depth, multi-vendor, multi-layer. We can't just be beholden to one manufacturer. Do you think it's some of that we're so used to building strategies around that we're having a hard time letting go? I found myself in that same scenario this week, talking to my team, right? And I'm like, but wait a minute, maybe we need this to be another vendor because, you know what I mean? And I found myself in that same hamster wheel.
I do. I think part of it is the fact that we're conditioned to that. Is the fox, watching the hen house, so to speak. If we go all in and they have a major systemic vuln, then it cripples everything. But if Heartbleed didn't teach us the first time, Log4j certainly did. When it's running on Minecraft, every endpoint software, every enterprise tech software, everybody was running that. It wasn't just one or the other. So were you really protected by the fact that you had 7 vendors that were running this library you didn't know about versus one giant vendor that was running it in 7 products? I don't know that either one of those is better than the other. So I do think a little bit of that is conditioning. And we heard that for years in the services world, right? It was, oh, well, I can't get my tech and my service from the same company. I don't like that. Well, that really shifted 5-6 years ago where services companies became more prescriptive and said, no, we looked at the tech or we built it because the other stuff just didn't work. And we're going to bring both to market. It's a platform that will manage for you. And now security leaders are actively embracing that, which is great because guess what? Tech and IT did that 10 years ago. So we're finally catching up to some extent.
Right. And we all know that if you're going to roll out a zero trust architecture, you're not going to have one vendor relationship. You're not even going to have 5 vendor relationships because it's not even a 5 SKU purchase, right? So, I mean, the value of consolidation is getting you down from maybe 60 to, 12, 15, 18 vendors. You're never going to get to 1, and you're probably not going to get to 5. It's still going to be somewhere in the dozens, I think, before we get there. So how much risk do you really have with your consolidation? Because you've got other vendors in the mix. And look, in some of these areas, you're even going to have overlaps in those, as the market continues to consolidate and we see some movement. There was one other thing in your report that you sent me that I was a little surprised on. I want to touch on a little bit. You said reduce or avoid some investment areas. One of them was managed security service providers. Now, you cover the services space. Why call out MSSPs there? What was the rationale there?
Because they deserve it. And saying that as someone that's covered them for 7 years and worked in it for 10 before that, but I'm only partly kidding, although I'm not entirely kidding. The reason why we say that is because MSSPs unfortunately devolved towards the end to become little more than alert factories. The raw thing that came in was a log. The thing that came out was a templatized, uncustomizable ticket with some phone calls attached to it. And so you wound up with these vendors that had this kind of, breadth approach, right? They were a portfolio of 50 average, maybe 5 good services overall at best. What really, part of why we talk about looking at MSSPs differently and saying, okay, move away from that, is because of the rise of managed detection and response. It solves a hard problem, detection and response. It's more collaborative. It's more sophisticated. It's a deeper service as opposed to a wide service. And so part of what we're saying there is, okay, let's get rid of, kind of that MSSP investment that might have been doing a lot of generic things that weren't of high value. And instead think about doing something like managed detection and response, which is significantly higher value, much more customizable, much more collaborative, and really kind of targets a set of use cases that are highly important, especially in the world of adversaries, ransomware, malware in general. Even take something like ransomware. One of the great premises of MDR is not that if you have a ransomware breakout, it's going to stop it when stuff gets encrypted. Even by then for MDR, it might be too late, although maybe they could contain it. You should find all that stuff that happens before that, before the ransomware implant actually happens, right? Before anything's executed, MDR should detect it before that. So we're really saying sort of shift away from the generic use cases of MSSPs and really go all in on more of a managed detection and response approach, which to us does include things like XDR, for example.
And I mean, Tyler can probably attest to this as well, but, clients are getting smart to that. There's so many organizations that we're out there testing, right? And their MSSP isn't seeing anything, no telemetry, no alerts, anything. And they're coming back to us saying, why didn't my MSSP see any of this, right? So, it's one of those scenarios where, I'm calling it the Walmart effect. It's becoming the Walmart effect.
Yeah, it absolutely is.
There has to be some good solutions, though, and some education around that, because for a long time, the ones that are good, they've always been branded under MSSP, and shifting their kind of market and or name vertical hasn't taken effect for even some of the good ones. So kind of being savvy to that and understanding what you're getting, what you're actually looking for, and how you can use them, I think becomes a very important conversation.
Yeah, maturing your use cases, understanding exactly what you need help with. One of the things I walk through a lot of security leaders and their teams with is how to evaluate one of these organizations, how to run a proof of concept. And I say, look, if you have a SOC now or you have something close to it, let's go find 3 events that were problematic for you, and let's let that be your proof of concept. We can get this done in a day. You don't need a 30-day sort of stare at a dashboard once a week proof of concept. You can get a 4-hour one if you do it right. But you're absolutely right. It's understanding those use cases, because a lot of the MSSP appeal was your mess for less. We'll take it off your hands. We'll get our arms around it. The managed detection and response set of use cases is quite a bit more sophisticated to that, to your point. And also the other part is that there are certainly some MSSPs that maybe weren't so good that are going through some sort of brand laundering, if you will, where they're now advertising MDR, but their version of MDR looks a lot like their version of MSSP, just with many find and replaces in the copy.
Yeah, the reason I brought this up, because we're seeing about a quarter of spend going to services, and recommendation around MSSPs, what you're saying is don't spend on the broad MSSP portfolio, pick and choose the right kind of focus areas to spend that budget, because we are seeing more budgets going to service providers, and I just wanted to make sure people understood why, the difference between those. So that was perfect.
Awesome.
Yeah, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
Thanks for having me. This was great.
We're going to take a quick break and then cover the leadership and communications articles for this week.